Good morning. Welcome to our webinar for Executive Women's Council. We will get started momentarily. We'll just let people start filling up the room. Welcome to today's Executive Women's Council webinar. We will get started shortly. Welcome to today's Executive Women's Council webinar. We will get started momentarily, just letting a few more people come into the room. Good morning. Welcome to our Executive Women's Council webinar. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. Let a few more people join us. Good morning. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's Executive Women's Council webinar, Beyond Diversity, Developing an Anti-Racist Roadmap in Your Workplace. My name is Anna Stenson. I'm the Director of Programming for the Minneapolis Regional Chamber. We have been absolutely thrilled with the response to this event. I'm really looking forward to sharing this dynamic panel with all of you. We will be recording the session and you will receive a link once it is available. Feel free to submit your questions as we go in the Q&A section. No need to wait until the end, and our panelists will try to incorporate them as we go. I do want to take a minute to thank our sponsors. Our events would not be possible without them. Our premier sponsors are CenterPoint Energy, Lohman Abdo, SDK CPAs, Sunrise Banks, Voya Financial, and Excel Energy. Our supporting sponsors are McGough and Mortenson, and our event sponsors are Allied Parking and Firefly Credit Union. We are so grateful to all of them. So our topic today is Beyond Diversity, Developing an Anti-Racist Roadmap in Your Workplace. We as a society have some work to do, and it's going to take all of us. We're going to launch a poll right now to see how everyone is feeling, kind of take temperature of how you're feeling coming into today's session. So go ahead and take a minute and pick the choice that closely matches what you're feeling this morning. And while you're doing that, I will introduce our panel. I'm going to just introduce them quickly and we'll let them talk more about their roles and background. Today we have with us Dranelle Foster, Vice President, Senior Business Support Manager, Consumer Lending for Wells Fargo and Company. Philomena Morrissey-Sater, Director of Diversity and Inclusion and External Strategic Partnerships for Land O'Lakes. Alex Steinman, who's the CEO and co-founder of The Coven. And our moderator, Emily Fitzsimmons, who is the Engagement Manager for Make It MSP, which is the talent attraction and retention portion of Greater MSP. Welcome, all of you, thank you so much for being here today with us. And Emily, I will go ahead and turn it over to you. Also, let's launch the results of the poll so that we can see where we all are.
Well, great. This is wonderful. Thank you, everyone. This is Emily Fitzsimmons speaking, Engagement Manager for Make It MSP, as Anna introduced. Looks like a lot of us are showing up energized today, and I think the goal of today's conversation is to ensure that we can keep that energy going. For those of you that said urgent, to keep the urgency alive for this conversation. For those that feel fatigued, so you can feel that you have allies in the conversation. And then those that are nervous, to welcoming you to this conversation, because the best way to confront that nervousness and become comfortable in having these important conversations is to do so. So thank you all for being here. Before I kick it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, I wanted to give you guys a little insight into what we were thinking about as we were meeting to prepare for this conversation. And one of the really important things that we wanted to level set is that the work of anti-racism is truly a verb. This is the work that you do day in and day out to confront and dismantle systems of racism that show up uniquely in all of the spaces that we occupy. So as our panelists introduce themselves, I'll ask them to also answer a primer question, which is, what does anti-racism look like to you at work, in the community, at home, or internally? So with that, I'll kick it to Dronelle for the first introduction.
Wonderful, good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. So my name is Dronelle Foster. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I am with Wells Fargo. I'm a Senior Business Support Manager. I lead an operational Center of Excellence group. My background has primarily been in human resources, so I'm an HR practitioner as well. You know, in terms of the question around anti-racism and what that looks like, I've actually been following the readings of Dr. Ibram Kendi, and he's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I have been learning a lot from that, because no longer can we say that, you know, I'm not a racist, or, you know, I can't be a racist, right? But we start to talk about what does it mean to support anti-racist ideas, policies, and, you know, what does that mean when we talk about groups of people? And so I wanted to contrast a little bit of, you know, comments that you may hear, or actions, behaviors from a racist perspective. So when we think about ideas from a racist perspective, we're talking about someone that is saying a racial group is better, more superior than another group. But when we're talking about anti-racist, we're saying that all groups are equal and that we're treating them fair. When you think about policies under the guise of a racist, you may see things that yield racial inequities. And on the flip side of that, as an anti-racist, we're talking about those things that yield equity. And then just in the closing comments around people, you know, you would hear things that suggest or support racist actions, you know, kind of maintaining the status quo. Or it also could be by not doing any action at all. And on the flip side of that, as an anti-racist, we're talking about supporting any and all anti-racist policies and ideas. And so when I think about that, it also talks about at home, on the community, in the workplace, it's speaking up and standing out and addressing those things when we see them, using our power, using our influence to create change, and also to think about what does it look like to dismantle some of these systems as well that have historically been in place. So that's kind of what I would share.
That's excellent, thank you. And that's a great resource that we could perhaps share how to be an anti-racist following this webinar as well. Well, thank you for that. And Philomena, kick it to you for your introduction and answering the primer.
I'm going to say good afternoon because I'm an early bird, so I've been up for a long time. Afternoon. Hi, everyone. I lead our diversity and inclusion efforts at Land O'Lakes. I have been at Land O'Lakes for about 3 years. I had formerly been a colleague with Dronelle Foster and worked at Wells Fargo for 29 years until I moved to agriculture and dairy. And so I've learned a lot in the last few years. I'm also a mom of 3. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today as we talk about like how do we influence our families. I have a side gig at St. Kate's, an adjunct professor. So What I read, when I think about being an anti-racist, Emily, I think about how do I integrate this into all aspects of my life. So in the work that I do at Land O'Lakes, in the community involvement that I'm in, what are those questions that I ask? How do I challenge respectfully? As I work to raise 3 young adults, what are those conversations like? And how do we talk about what's happening in the world? And how do I best support our kids to be leaders of that with their friend groups and who they encounter? And then when they're worried, which many young adults are, how do we lift their spirits? So those are kind of like broadly some of the things that I think about. And then I'll talk a little bit later, but what are those everyday actions? Every single day we have interactions with people, and what do those look like?
That's wonderful. Thank you, Philomena, and thank you for reminding us to remember the role of youth in this conversation as well. They may not be present today, but they're definitely present in the broader conversation, so thank you. Well, finally, I'll kick it to Alex.
Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm also an early riser. I am Alex Wetsteinman, co-founder and CEO of The Coven. We're a community and workspace for women, non-binary, and trans folks. Opened about 2 years ago in Minneapolis, and just opened a St. Paul location in January. We really center our experiences around women, non-binary, and trans folks, so we are open to all genders. We focus our efforts around physical and psychological safety in the workplace, as well as the growth and development of folks of color and women. And so, this work is really rooted in the mission of doing the most good in our community and what we do here at the Coven. When I think of anti-racism, I think of it as a verb. It's an action and it's a practice. It's something that you have to do every single day. It's not enough to not be racist, to just not be racist, but we really have to step into bending towards that direction of justice. And so when I think about anti-racism, I really think of it as something that you get up, you eat it for breakfast, you do it every single day, and you practice it throughout your life. It's not a destination, it's not a journey to reach the top of the mountain and get a medal for, but it's something that is rewarding in the work, in the process.
Well, wonderful. It's always good to have early risers. I know you guys bring energy to the part of the day where I'm usually lacking in. So great to have you guys here too. Well, thank you, Alex. And I think that's actually a really good segue into our first question today, which I'll actually tee up Philomena for. And this conversation around where this work starts, right? It starts truly in the morning, but it starts at home as well. And Philomena, you being a leader in the DEI space at your organization, Land O'Lakes, you are familiar with what it looks like within the bounds of the office and the workplace. But I also know you've noted that you're passionate about where anti-racism shows up in social circles and at home. I'd like to ask you to share with our attendees today, what responsibility and role do you and everyone on this call as leaders have to practice anti-racism beyond the walls of the workplace?
Emily, glad to know that, Alex, you're one of my morning lark people, so yay. But I know who I can call at night, and that's Dronelle, so it's always good to have multiple, right? So I'm going to start with, all of us are on, we have a really good group on the phone today, and I believe, and Alex and Dronelle both alluded to this, it really starts with self. And so I cannot lead unless I understand where I am. How I grew up, what were those messages that I grew up with, and then what do I need to learn? I mean, and I love, Alex, that you said it's not like a one and done. You don't just read the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, check, done. I've got to live it out. And so I think starting with self first, there's a lot of different assessments out there, there's reading material. How do we do that? I'm in a book club. And so for me, that's a great way to have conversation, to read books that are challenging and to have discussion and do that. So I think that that's really piece number one. Two is, as we look at our families, how do we influence? There's a lot of great books out there now. They weren't out there when my kids were growing up, but how do I talk to my kids? How do I make sure that my kids notice difference and are not colorblind? because as I've done a lot of coaching with leaders, that's how they grew up. Like, let's not notice difference. Let's treat everyone the same. So I think that that's a powerful piece. And as a parent, what I tried to do with my kids, we live in Eagan, Minnesota, which is not overly diverse. However, my kids have been on many adventures with me. When they were younger, they really liked it. As they grew older, maybe not so much, but getting them involved in the community, having them see, I was a confirmation leader, and one of our quests was to bring our kids to a different faith community. And so I talked with the other leaders, where are you going? What are you doing? I brought our kids, 20 kids, 3 different times with 3 different kids to a Baptist church in St. Paul. And so the power was the experience, but the conversation that followed when we got back and had what was this experience like in comparison to Catholic? What do you think it's like to be the only? What was that experience like? These 20 white kids had not ever experienced being different from the majority, right? And then the conversation was, what do we do then? How can you support kids who are the only in your class? What could that be like, right? So I think that's a piece too. And then I think also, and we looked at the list of all the people calling in today, think about the organizations that you're involved with, whether it's on behalf of your family, whether it's on behalf of work. Janelle and I both are on the board of Cookie Cart, which is an amazing organization transforming lives through leadership development. So if you need a sweet, I'm going to just say order from Cookie Cart because it transforms lives. But one of the things that we talked about on our board is, what do we need to do to be an anti-racist organization? We already have a powerful mission of what we're doing, but we need to take a look at the systems, right, within our nonprofit board and say, are we doing enough? Do we need to do more? What does that look like? What are the behaviors like? What are our policies and practices? And then my last piece, and this is the one that I'm going to encourage you to speak up. What happens when you're a bystander? And often it happens, and I'm going to tell you when it happens fast. You might be in a meeting, you might be with your friends, you might be in a random place, but what do you do? So I'm going to give you a quick example. I was shopping at Quick Trip. I'm a morning lady, worked out, went there 6:15 in the morning, lines form in stores, right? Really, and who goes first, who goes second? So a young Latino man went up to get served, and the white older gentleman in front of me yelled at 6:15 in the morning, in America, we stand in line. The whole store went completely quiet. When these things happen, it's just like shocking. You can't believe it, right? In that moment, I had to say to this gentleman, excuse me, but I don't know if you realize, but he actually was in line before you were. Step in, right? Because no one knew what to say. So the young gentleman turned around to say to the older shopper, I wanted to let you know that I just finished active duty and I'm an American citizen, right? And the whole store was just like in shock and awe. I stepped out of line, walked out of the store with our young vet to thank him and just like have a conversation with him and let him know that we so appreciate who he is in that very moment. But when these things, and my blood pressure is rising as I tell you that story, because when it happens so quickly. But when we don't say something, we're doing something, aren't we? How do we do it respectfully? How do we help others understand? And so I'll pass it back to you, Emily, but I think that we have a great responsibility, especially right now, when many people feel emboldened to say what they think is their truth.
Well, thank you, Philomena, for sharing that story. And I actually think I'd like to follow up with a question that we had in our chat that, that was a very explicit example of an act of racism. How do you call out or call in microaggressions? What about the ones that the intent may not match the impact? What advice would you have for those instances that our audience may encounter?
Are you directing that one to me, Emily?
Yeah, I'll kick that to you.
Okay. I didn't know if my other panelists want to weigh in, so feel free to. So Matt, the example I gave you is a macroaggression, right? So that was significant. There was no doubt in anyone's mind about that. Microaggressions could be, like someone rolls their eyes in a meeting, right? Or someone says something and then all of a sudden you get some of those nonverbal responses. You walk down the hall and you say hi to someone, they see you, but they don't say hi back. Or something happens in a meeting and it's very clear that person disagrees without verbally saying something. And so I think the opportunity is to have that coaching moment. Hey, can you tell me more about what's happening? I'm seeing, that you are disagreeing, but you're not saying anything. Why is that? Tell me more about that. Are you aware when you have those nonverbal cues, you are sending a message without saying something? What's that about? So I think, at least for me as a leader, I would have that discussion with that individual so they understand the impact about that. And we've actually done some training around microaggressions and have teams agree to call it out. Like, this is not acceptable as we're trying to build an inclusive behavior. So how do we hold each other accountable? Because you don't want it to just be on the leader of the team, because guess what? When the leader's not around, then what happens? Janelle and Alex, you may have additional ideas.
No, I agree completely with you. I mean, when I think about microaggressions, thinking about those happening constantly, daily, throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year, especially when we're in a place of work. And, those take a toll. Those are emotionally taxing. That's another place as a person of color, a BIPOC, that you also have to navigate. And sometimes it's not targeted against a particular group, but sometimes it could be. But also thinking about having to navigate that, how to show up each and every day. You're trying to do your job as best you can, show up in a great positive way, making a meaningful impact, but then you also have this thing that is constantly pecking at you. Think about a mosquito bite. Equating this mosquito bite to a microaggression and getting constantly attacked with those microaggressions. Those are micro assaults, they're micro invalidations. It's another form of racism, depending on the type of microaggression that we're addressing.
I don't have anything to add that hasn't already been said.
Well, great. And thank you guys for answering, that important question about, calling out, calling in, and recognizing the experiences of our BIPOC community. That, I think, Janelle, what a great Minnesotan expression to call out mosquito bite. But I kind of want to use, this as a chance to call on you, Janelle, to talk a little bit more about organizationally, right? So like going from the very personal acts of anti-racism to the big organizational. So, you yourself are a leader at your organization, and even while you may not be explicitly within the DEI a team within Wells Fargo, you still have a role to play. So would you mind sharing, what can someone similar to you that also holds a leadership role, what can you do to advance the work of DEI within and through your organization?
Sure. And I'll just give a little context. So, I've been at the organization now 25 years. I mentioned that I have this background in human resources, but I started in the front line as a teller. And so that was kind of my upbringing, and then kind of working my way through the ranks. And obviously, as I continue to advance my career, I've had the opportunity to work with some pretty incredible leaders, been a part of some amazing teams, different divisions within the organization. And so with that, again, using my own personal story, being able to take action, being able to call out, if you're seeing something or noticing something that's impacting the workplace, or thinking about human capital, or if we're trying to solve some diversity and inclusion challenges and we're not calling the things that are actually happening to the table, I think we're doing a disservice. We're not addressing the elephant on the table. And so while I don't have that D&I title, again, I'm very passionate, being a person of color, about this work, being marginalized, transitioning from various social economic backgrounds, education backgrounds. I personally have made that shift. So this is work that's been rooted in me. I think about the communities in which I live, where I volunteer my time, given my time, talent, treasures. These are all things that are so important to who I am and to individuals even. So how do we take those skills, those talents, those gifts that we have and create change where we work? You know, I work at Wells Fargo for a reason. I believe in this organization. I want to make sure that we win as an organization as well. So if there are, you know, issues that need to be addressed, conversations that need to be had, I need to be bolden as well. I need to raise the flag and say, hey, you know, something's not right here. Or, hey, I'm noticing that, you know, certain behaviors, maybe it's our hiring, maybe it's something in terms of treatment, you know, for a particular group of individuals, age, race, what have you, but it's my personal responsibility to do that. And through our employee resource groups, what we call a team member network at Wells Fargo, through our diversity and inclusion councils, really kind of bubbling up best practices. Here are things that are happening at other organizations, having our antenna up, bringing that information inside the walls of Wells Fargo. Those are different perspectives. I do a lot of networking here in the Twin Cities. Member of the Make It MSP effort. I do a lot of work with Black African American professionals across the Twin Cities. And when you sit and you hear some of these experiences, when we talk about career development, career advancement, I'm a transplant here to the Twin Cities. I know a lot of people come here and they don't stay, and there's a reason for that. So how do we address some of those things that are constant themes, and what's going to be our approach in terms of how we look to evaluate that and do a pivot, you know, make some strategic decisions around these experiences, and really making sure that everyone has equal access, that everyone has the opportunity to thrive, and not just some of us, but all of us. And so those are just things for me personally that I have the pleasure of doing this work, leading this work, along with many other people within my organization too. You know, if you want to go fast, they say go alone. If you want to go far, you go with other people. And so this is not the work of just one or two, but the work of everyone, and how can we all contribute?
Thank you for sharing that, and also for the work you do in our community. I think, I think your closing comment about if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together is actually a really good segue into Alex. My next question for you. You know, as an entrepreneur, as someone that started a business, that went out on your own with some great team members, you know, how do you approach your unique role in the role of our work of anti-racism? And how would you encourage other entrepreneurs or other small businesses that maybe don't have large resources like a larger organization to go about this work?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think so much of this work is in building empathy muscles, right? So it's understanding what other people are going through who are different from you, whether from a socioeconomic, from a racial perspective, from a gender perspective. It's really understanding, like, what is that person going through? How can I be supportive in their growth and development, because my success is wrapped up in their success. I think Philomena gave it a great example of taking, 20 white kids to a Black church and, watching them understand what it's like to be the only. It shouldn't have to take us going into another space and experiencing it, but we're such experiential people that it sometimes takes really understanding, this is a neighborhood, this is a Muslim person, this is a person who's different than me, and really getting to know people on that level. And so, when we sought out to build this business, it was really rooted in understanding what does the community need. And so as an entrepreneur, we weren't necessarily just going to create a space for women and say, this is what you need, women. We were going to build it with community. And I think that we were answering problems or, presenting solutions to problems that folks actually had. And I think so often entrepreneurs get so wrapped up in solving, something that they care deeply about, that we forget about what, the community needs or what our potential customers need. And so what we did was set out to do customer interviews. And so we did, we talked to hundreds of women over the course of a summer, focus group style. This was back when you could meet people in real person, in real life. But we met with, hundreds of women over the course of the summer to understand, what is it that you're experiencing in the workplace? What do you need out of us to feel heard and seen and validated, all of these needs that we have as human beings? And, from there, that's where we, stepped into our business. For those who are already established business owners and have established cultures within their organization, I think even people who aren't business owners can follow, some really simple things that, we can do as leaders. You don't have to give hundreds of thousands of dollars to an organization to make a strong impact. You can pay people fairly. You can offer, vacation or parental leave. You can ask somebody how they're doing when things are really bad. You can ask them how they're doing when things are going really well. I think one thing that came out of, the murder of George Floyd this summer was all of a sudden I had, hundreds of white people reaching out to me asking how I am. And it was like, you didn't care 2 weeks ago. So I think there's this need to hurry up and fix it. And like Jernal said, it's not about, going fast and putting a Band-Aid on something. That's not anti-racism. Anti-racism isn't, reaching out to your one Black friend every, tragedy. It's really connecting with somebody else, building a relationship, not saying you have to be friends with everybody, but building a relationship with somebody, building those empathy muscles so that you understand what other people might be going through at their highs and their lows. And so I think as a small business owner or as any kind of organizational leader, it's really important that we're having conversations with communities, whether that's your employee community, whether that's your community outside of your walls, to get to know them and really know how to serve them so that when crisis hits, you can respond quickly, but you can also respond really thoughtfully and together, making really thoughtful choices.
Alex, something that you just said, I just wanted to add on to that. It's really about getting comfortable in discomfort. And
Yeah.
so if you're not leaning in and having some of these courageous conversations or putting yourself in spaces where maybe you're going to be the only person or preparing yourself to have a difficult conversation, I think that's the opportunity. I mean, that's when we start to expand our perspectives. We're listening, we're learning, we're listening to lived experiences just to give you a perspective. Because again, before George Floyd, I think we would have just been navigating the way that we have been all these years, and maybe slight progress and then, no progress at all. The conversations that we're having right now on racism, we're having these in the workplace. This topic was taboo previously, unless you were in a diversity and inclusion class. And even if you weren't in that class with your coworkers or with your manager. And so the game has changed drastically, but this was a conversation that would have been in the bucket of politics and religion. And now the invitation, it's in your face, like you have to engage.
Yeah.
And again, to not talk about it, to be silent, is also saying, you're being complacent, with kind of where we are as well. So I just wanted to add that, Alex, but thank you, great point.
No, thanks. And I mean, just to, one thing I think about is, we've talked about kind of going internally and kind of describing or identifying ways that you can be an anti-racist and then figuring out how to solve for your organization. I think organizations typically look internally as a whole, like a human being would, but they look internally as a whole and say, well, let's take this class or let's go through this training together. And I think those things are important and needed, but oftentimes they forget about looking outwardly to the community and understanding what's happening in culture right now. Are these things that we're implementing actually helpful? Is there, should we be putting, our efforts and resources into something else? And if you're constantly kind of looking inwardly and not actually understanding what's happening in the world around you, you won't be able to respond as quickly. And so that's one thing, that's one area that I think the Coven really excels in, is helping organizations to really understand what's happening in culture. And we've launched a new practice really about community conversations, about understanding what's the pulse of the community, so that you can look inwardly as well and be able to respond to both crises and kind of just the everyday.
That's excellent. Thank you all. And I'd actually like to pose a question to the full group. Alex, I want to call out that great comment about looking inward and outward. And I think something that's on all of our minds is to continue to look outward or onward, right? So what's the future? Janelle, when we last spoke, you had this great, really salient point about we are in such a time of collective consciousness right now. We're in a moment of history. But what advice would you all have for the organizations on this call to make sure that that moment's not lost, whether you're a small organization, a medium or a large? What do we need to do to continue to mobilize this work and make sure that the momentum and the urgency is not lost?
Yeah. Well, I can go ahead and start and get us kicked off here. So May 25th, Monday, May 25th was difficult for, a number of reasons. The first one obviously was the death of George Floyd here in South Minneapolis. Watching a man in pain being tortured, and then for that to play out for almost 9 minutes. That morning, we also saw, or later on that day, we also saw the footage of the Central Park incident with the bird watcher and the dog walker. So this is Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, no relation. But we also saw a white executive at an investment firm weaponize her white privilege. And again, that could have been a terrible incident and outcome for this Black man based on his race. And he's simply asking her to leash her dog. And so, that George Floyd, it just impacted so many of us in so many different ways. And for anyone that watched that video, I know some people chose not to, that's something that's never going to detach from your memory. And with that being here in Minneapolis, Wells Fargo, we have a huge presence here. We had a lot of team members, about 18,000 people that we were connecting with, reaching out to, our senior leadership team, addressing kind of what had happened. But also at the same time, I felt really compelled to, spark a movement. I felt like I turned into an overnight activist inside the walls of Wells Fargo and, started this campaign called Minnesota Listens. And it was really rooted primarily in the need to talk, the healing that needed to happen. And so we started to do these listening circles, with team members to have them share, these visceral feelings that they were having in response to what had just happened, the days before. And we're continuing to do that work. We also have launched through this Minnesota Listens platform, Courageous Conversations. And we got people dialing in outside of the state of Minnesota to these conversations to talk about what does it mean to listen, learn, and lead. Uncomfortable conversations. The conversation that we had just last week was around Black perspectives. What's the Black experience, and letting folks talk about these experiences, because we also want to have these stories amplified. We need team members to know kind of what the realities are of some of our coworkers and the experiences that they live with day in and day out, and how they have to navigate the world. And so we just had such a powerful response to that. This is work that has been backed by our senior leaders here in the state of Minnesota, but we also have things that are happening top of the house at Wells Fargo as well. With 270,000 plus people, it's kind of hard to mobilize kind of this new direction around what it's going to look like for us to be an anti-racist organization, but that work is happening. But at the same time, based on the immediacy of what happened here in the Twin Cities, here, as ground zero, we also needed to mobilize and get people involved and create these safe spaces for these conversations to actually happen and for this learning to actually happen.
I just want to add on to one thing, Drenell, that you alluded to, and you used the word trauma. And so I just want to acknowledge the trauma that people have experienced, starting with COVID, and really the impact on the Black and Brown community, and then also with George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. And I've just been paying super close attention to that, because there's a lot of heavy lifting that is happening in our organizations, particularly by our Black employees. And so it's something to think about organizations, is acknowledging that, and then what can we do? So we had a speaker come in last week, and she's amazing, Camille Cyprin. She's in the Twin Cities to talk about trauma, toxicity, what happens, and held a workshop for our employees on that. We also at LOL have a new mental health professional. And because of COVID and everything that's happening, she's able to do her services virtually with people. And there's going to be no cost to employees from now through the end of the year. And so we're just trying to figure out, what are systems or what are ways that we can best acknowledge and provide support for employees, because as you all know, whether you enter through the door or you're working virtually, whatever happens outside of work impacts how we show up in the workplace. So just one additional comment to add.
No, that's a great comment, Philomena. I was thinking about one more piece, Emily, when we're having these conversations with team members, local team members. Someone at our organization led the march that happened, the protest on the 35W bridge, and the semi that came across that bridge. We had team members, and so they even talked about these experiences. Again, part of this trauma, not specific racial trauma, but trauma from that particular event. But I think there's so much around the mental health, obviously living through this pandemic, this health pandemic, but also if you're a person of color living through a racial pandemic as well. And we've been doing that for such a long time. Like, it's time for things to change. When I hear the comment, I can't wait for things to go back to normal, many of us are not looking forward to going back to a normal. We're looking to create a new normal. And so I think that's something else that we need to be very mindful of.
I think one thing that's really important in an organization is to like really boil this down and like to understand, to do your work on racism, right? So what we're talking about is the fear of Black and brown bodies. Like, we're not talking about, the idea that, a Black CEO can't do as good of a job as a white CEO. Like, at the very basic level, we're talking about the fear of Black bodies. And we've seen that in the murders of Black folks on the street, in, the dog walker situation. We see that in her fear of a Black man asking her to leash her dog. And those types of situations are happening all the time. And so when we're talking about like microaggressions, and we're talking about, the trauma that comes with those things, it's truly like in the devaluing of a human body, which then gives, power to a white person to touch my hair, or gives power to a white person to ignore my comments in a meeting, or to roll their eyes, or to walk by without saying hello. Like, all of these things are rooted in the fear of Black bodies. And so I think that is the real work at hand here. And I think when we start to work on the, stepping into those uncomfortable conversations that you need to have with yourself and with your community, that's really where the change starts to happen, is like really sitting in that piece right there. And that's where justice comes in. It's not just equity, it's not just equality. It's like, that's where we start to talk about power structures, right? Because even at an organization like mine that is 8 people, there's 4 co-founders, we're a very small organization. I can't deny that I carry some power in my seat as a co-founder and a CEO, even though my front desk person might be, considered family in our organization. And I think that happens a lot in large organizations too, where you have a team that is really close. And even like the leader can sometimes be like the family, a family member, but truly you have to look at those power dynamics in a hierarchical structure that, are exacerbated by, skin color too. So I think these are just things to continue to think about. It's not, this is the work of a generation. I think John Lewis said it best. This isn't a Band-Aid that you can put on this. This is something that we have to continue to take steps forward and start to eliminate, or continue eliminating, that fear of Black bodies.
Thank you all. I think that call to action is a great way for us to continue this conversation by answering now some of the questions from the audience that have very much echoed a lot of the sentiments that you have all shared as part of this. We'll go to this first one here from Deb. So she asks, what tips would you offer to help white males who have had the benefit of white privilege feel part of the solution? How would you engage them and help them use their power to benefit all members of the community? I'll pose this to whoever is open to answering this.
Well, I can start. I think one of the, again, like if we're thinking of this as like the fear of Black bodies, I think one thing to, that actually makes this kind of simple is it's like my humanity is wrapped in your humanity, which means that when we're seeing microaggressions happen or something happens where there's an opportunity to step in and truly like put your body in front of another Black body to be protecting, or to support or to help or to heal, all of those things are actually like, great signals for your brain and for the people around you that like, you're an anti-racist because you are truly taking action to put your body in front of somebody else's body as like a protection. Now that is like something kind of, when we're thinking about it, that can be like a violent, like it can feel like we're in a violent situation. And in the workplace, it's not always a violent situation, right? It's just, it's a microaggression. It's somebody touches my hair, it's somebody gives me a look, it's all of those types of things. And so I think one thing that, Philomena talked about in her example of, being in the grocery store, it's like, it's truly like thinking of my humanity is wrapped in your humanity. This person is, is being a jerk, but is also being, extremely racist. And so it's saying something in that moment. And I think, perhaps white men can kind of, as they're seeing other white men step into that space, that they're going to start to feel comfortable saying something, because it's taboo, especially in Minnesota. It's taboo to like say something, in those situations. But I think the more that we have, white men stepping into those spaces, the more that they're sitting in their uncomfortable feelings, the more others around them will do so as well.
And I'll add on to that. I think what I've noticed and what continues to be very evident is that white men are finding their diversity voice. They are showing up differently. They are paying attention. So use an example of being in an all-white space. So situations where there's a big executive meeting, they're inviting kind of the up and coming talent to this meeting to do like a networking event. And you notice that person. It's a person of color, maybe it's a female. But again, what can that white executive do to help that person feel comfortable in this room? Maybe of white faces, white leaders, to help introduce them, make some connections for them. I think about how they can use or share their power to amplify a voice. So think about in a meeting where someone has brought up a great idea, the idea wasn't acknowledged, and someone else is getting ready to speak, and that person brings it back to you, bringing up that idea to make sure that it gets acknowledged and that it's entered into the room. I just think so much around that whole concept of allyship, proudly wearing someone else's jersey and being comfortable in doing so. So again, promoting them, what's the word I want to use? Sponsoring them, supporting them, really advocating for that person. So those are some ideas in terms of white men and how they can step into the space as well and find their voice and use their voice.
I think another piece I'm thinking, I just got certified a couple of years ago to administer a tool called the IDI, Intercultural Development Inventory. So I've been working my way around Land O'Lakes with one other leader from HR, working with business lines. And right now I'm working with one of our more traditional business lines. And the majority of people in this business are white males. And so we provide the overview, but the power has been in the one-on-one coaching session. So they can see where are they from a standpoint of intercultural competency, providing a safe space for them to ask questions, because I think that's a piece too. Like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, so I don't say something. How do I ask this question, right? So helping them kind of build that muscle, and then say, okay, now that you see where you are, you're looking at your business, what can you do? What can you do to take action to integrate this in? And so I think that is really important. And how do you bring others along with? And then I always like to acknowledge, that's like a super secret weapon that I use, is recognition. Like, woo, you did this, right? Stepping in slowly but surely, taking those steps, providing that acknowledgement, which I think is really important, because I think, you know, many leaders have really good intentions. They just want to know more about the how. How do I do this?
And remember too, for those companies, I know we have all different types that are here on this call today. If you have an ERG, an employee resource group, or what we call again, a team member network group, for those white men to go and get engaged and start there. You know, find ways to even, you know, think about the community, think about a nonprofit. Where are some baby steps that they can take to actually help them on that journey?
That's great. And Janelle, I think that actually bleeds well into the question that we had from Bonnie about, you know, you three are so closely tied to the community. You have this unique perspective of perhaps where the most and targeted efforts could be directed right now. So Bonnie asked a question about, you know, how to support businesses and residents of our region, of our community that are struggling and not receiving aid. So from your three unique perspectives, what advice do you have on where and what we as a collective of female leaders can do to support that would be most helpful and expedited?
I think one area to look at is, you know, one, recognizing what your superpower is as an individual or as an organization. So many organizations and businesses after the murder of George Floyd and during the uprising were, you know, pausing their business, ourselves included, to make sure that we were all serving the community. So making sure that we were, you know, making sure that supplies and food and resources were getting to places that needed to. And now we're seeing, you know, obviously a slowdown of that as things start to, you know, open up. And, you know, we forget we're in the middle of two very crazy crises right now. And so there's many things that are happening that are causing folks to slow down. You know, we don't have endless income. We don't have endless revenue within our organization to, you know, be a drop site every day for the rest of our lives. However, we do have really great partnerships with corporate organizations that can drop off, you know, large donations, and then we can work with our community members on the ground to make sure that those resources get distributed appropriately. So I think knowing what your superpower is, for us during that crisis, it was our space and our network. And so we use that to our benefit. For other organizations, it was, you know, their deep connections with community organizers on the ground who, you know, we also used to help make sure that we were getting supplies to the right spaces. I think one of the things that has been the most challenging over the last couple months here, or at least for me to watch, has been the lack of input from our government, the lack of resources distributed from our government to make sure that people have secure housing, to make sure that people have the resources that they need to make sure businesses can reopen again. I think there's just been such it's just such a polarizing moment that we're having in history right now that, you know, doesn't allow us to have real conversations about where resources need to be. And so what I would encourage people to do is, again, thinking of this not just as like, what can I do today, but what is the long game here? Is making sure that our elected officials who are elected to work for us are actually working for us and for our small businesses. And for our community members and for our houseless folks. So let's make sure that the people who, you know, we're going to campaign for, that we're going to support, that we're going to endorse, like those people are actually going to do that work. And that's what I've been most disappointed in the last few months. And so this work is actually like really centered in how do we change policy too. And I know that's the work of many of you likely on the phone, is, you know, advocating for small businesses, for BIPOC folks. And you have to just continue to do that work, and it's you know, tireless. It's ongoing. And so again, I would think about this to the point of the question is like, what can we do? It's get to know what policies are in place that are holding people back, that are not supporting ways to deploy resources in a really timely manner.
Great answer, Alex. One thing I'm just going to throw out there, because we've been talking a lot about it as well and questioning, is around supplier diversity and supporting, again, these Black-owned businesses. I think that's another great opportunity, another great way. You know, we've seen the devastation up and down Lake Street, the devastation that hit over in North Minneapolis. So again, not just a one-time effort contribution, but, you know, what can we do ongoingly, collective, as a community to help rebuild in those cases. And even just with COVID, you know, these businesses have been hit the hardest. You know, we're talking about frontline essential workers that will probably never open. They're doing their best to try and reopen if they have that opportunity. But I think as organizations, we need to go back and re-examine what businesses do we support, suppliers are we supporting, are there opportunities, and if not, how do we create those? How do we just go back and rewrite some of those commitments and engagement opportunities? I think that's a big opportunity for a lot of us to go and re-examine.
I also think I agree with Alex and Dronell. And there's power when we put people, organizations together. So there's an initiative called and Make It MSP is a part of that. Many of the organizations who are on the call, the Corporate and Community Coalition. I think there's over 35 or 40 organizations really looking at the collective voice. To your point, Alex, what if we all voice and determine what are those 1 or 2 or 3 significant policy issues from a racism, anti-racism perspective? What if we pooled some of our money for philanthropy together to support the BIPOC communities? What would that look like? What if all these organizations who have amazing resources can share together? So I don't have to recreate what someone like Dronell did at Wells Fargo. So I think, thinking collectively too, what can we do as a region? I think that's going to be really powerful. So more to come on that, as we get farther down the road, we definitely will be sharing with the chambers, Make It MSP will be promoting, we'll be looking at all sorts of different ways to share with the broader community, not just the 35 organizations that are a part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you all for providing such personal perspective as part of this conversation, and also actionable things that we can do in our organizations and teams today. It's a great conversation. Thank you for letting Make It MSP and myself be part of it. I'll kick it back to Anna, and I just want to offer also a sincere thank you to the people on the call that asked questions, that communicated with one another, that did an excellent example of a call-in for me using gender neutral terms. I think that's a great example of how we're in this together, just like Philomena said. So I want to thank you all for doing that. And then I'll kick it back to Anna to wrap us up.
Thank you, Emily. I'll just throw in that one of my favorite things about being originally from the South is that I can say y'all, and that accounts for everybody. It's very gender neutral. Thank you guys, and then I just did it. Thank you all for sharing your time with us today. This is a big issue, and while it's not going to happen overnight, there are some concrete things that we can do to help move ourselves and our organizations further down the path that we need to be on. There will be a post-event email that comes out that will have tons of resources. We're going to consolidate a bunch of resources that we've been tossing around for you, and there will be contact information for all of our speakers today as well. Thank you again to all of our sponsors. Stay dry out there. It's storming pretty good. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for being here.
Bye-bye.
For hosting.
Thanks, everyone.
Well done, Alex and Dronell.
You too, Philomena.
And
Thank
Emily.
you.
Yes,
Good
thank
job.
you all. Great to see you.
All right, have a good one. Bye now.